Okay, let's take some geometry terms. If you're going to be able to do well in geometry, you have to know the Swedish term and, of course, the English term now as we're doing maths in English. So, if we were to look at these different angles, you know that this type of angle in Swedish is called spetsig, and it's very logical, really, that it's pointed, and that's what the word spetsig means. But in English, we have a different word for a small angle like that, and we say that it's an acute angle. And that means that it's any angle less than 90 degrees. In Swedish, you have the word trubbig for an angle that is larger than 90 degrees. But we would call this angle obtuse. So any angle that is larger than 90 degrees is called an obtuse angle. Any angle that is 90 degrees, and we show this, these ones look 90 degrees, but to show that they're supposed to be exactly 90 degrees, we draw a little square in the corner here. And that means that it's rättvinklig, which in English we would call right angled. So we have a right angle here, and that means that it's exactly 90 degrees. Then we have the angle that goes outside. Maybe we're not interested in the angle inside here. We're interested in the rest of the angle. This angle is 360 degrees minus this little angle here. This angle here, let's call it A. We would call it the reflex angle, the angle on the outside of the other angle, if this one was B. Then we would, in English, have the same word. We'd call it the reflex angle. And that means that it's less than 360 degrees, less than a full circle, but greater than 180 degrees, because otherwise it would be an obtuse angle. Then some of the things we use in geometry to measure angles. In Swedish, you call it a gradskiva, and in English, we call it a protractor. Protractor. Like tractor, but protractor. Gradskiva, and it's for measuring angles. Then we have set squares. Why do we have set squares when we actually can measure angles quite easily with a protractor? Well, we use set squares because they always have fixed angles. If you want to make a quick 90-degree angle, you can use one of the two set squares. One set square always has two angles of 45 degrees and 190, and the other type of long, slim set square has an angle of 30 degrees in one corner and 60 degrees in the other. So if you want to make a 60-degree angle really quickly, it's easy to use a set square for that. And then another thing that we use in geometry is a compass. We would call this a compass, and we can make circles with a compass, or we can do construction as well, so that we can make a particular shape or form or length of a line using a compass. When lines are parallel to one another, in Swedish, parallella linjer, in English, almost the same, but notice that we have a double L first and then a single L afterwards. So parallel lines. And then, if we would like to make one line exactly dissect the other line or intersect the other line at 90 degrees, we would call that a perpendicular line. So these, or we drop down a perpendicular to another line. It means we drop down one line so that it's exactly at 90 degrees compared with the other line. So these are the terms we would use in English geometry. An acute angle, an obtuse angle, a right angled, a reflex angle. We'd use a protractor to measure angles. We'd use a set square to get exactly a 30, 60, 45 or 90 degree angle. We'd use a compass to make a circle or do any other sort of construction in geometry. Parallel lines is almost the same, and a perpendicular line is what you would call lodrätt. But then we also have different types of triangles. We would call this angle a right-angled triangle. Any triangle with one right angle in is called a right-angled triangle. Any triangle that has two sides the same, and we show that it has two sides the same by making this one single line through each of these lines, means these sides are the same. It means that this side has a different length here, it has two dots in, to say that it's not the same as these two. What do we know then about this? It's got a very unusual name in English, isosceles. And it's not super important that you remember it, it's just that we would call any likbent triangle an isosceles triangle. The thing that's special about isosceles triangle is because these lengths are the same, the angles here are also the same. So this angle x would be exactly the same as this angle x. So isosceles triangle has two angles at the bottom of the legs where the lengths are the same, have exactly the same number of degrees. This one is called in Swedish liksidig. It means that all the sides are the same. So you notice that I have one dash through each of the lines. And in English we would call that an equilateral triangle. Equal. Everything has the same length, equilateral. So this is an equilateral triangle for us. And something very special about any equilateral triangle, if all three sides are the same, we know that all the angles in a triangle add up to be 180 degrees. So that every single angle in this triangle must be the same. It must be a third of 180 degrees, which is 60 degrees. So whenever you have an equilateral triangle, the degrees of the angle are always 60, 60, 60. So that's a useful thing to remember about equilateral triangles. Then we have this shape where all of the sides are the same, all of the angles are 90 degrees, and you call it kvadrat in Swedish, and we call it a square, which of course you're familiar with. A rectangle, we would also call a rectangle, and here we have the typical difference between Swedish, where you often use a K, English would often use a C, and quite often we will swap around the E and the L, so LE to spell rectangle in English. If you have all lengths the same, but now the angle is not 90 degrees, it's a different angle. It's like a squished square pushed over on the side. We call it a rhomb. We have almost exactly the same word, but we spell it slightly different. We have a silent H in the word rhomb in English. Parallelogram is the same, with this difference that we have a double L here and a single L. Parallelogram. That means that the two lines here are parallel, but also the two lines here are parallel. Parallelogram has to have these two lines the same length, and these two lines are a different length to the top two lines. So the horizontal lines have one length, and the lines going up at an angle have another length. Otherwise, if they were the same length, it would be a rhomb. Then we have, in Swedish you call this a trapez. We have a very similar word in English, a trapezium. And then a circle is called a circle as well, but again we've changed the K for a C, and we've swapped the EL to LE in English. So a circle. The only other thing you really need for geometry terms is understanding, well, what is area in English? Well, area in English is really easy. It's exactly the same word. Area in Swedish is area in English. But tricky thing comes when we're talking about your Swedish word omkrets, because we have two different expressions for that. Most shapes, like squares or rectangles or triangles, we would call that in English the perimeter. That would be our definition of your word omkrets. But when it comes to circles, we do have a different word for omkrets then. We would actually call it the circumference. So the outside fence, if we were going to make a circular fence around a big field, we'd measure the size of that fence by measuring the circumference of the circle, the outside of the circle. And if we were doing it for a triangular field or a square field or a rectangular field, we would call it the perimeter, the outside. Whereas the area is a measurement of one length times another unit of length, has always a unit of centimeters squared, meters squared, millimeters squared. It's always one unit of length times another unit of length. Whereas the perimeter is just like stretching it out with a piece of string. So these are all the geometry terms you need to know. and understand the words in English as well as the Swedish words. And if you get confused, if I'm talking about an equilateral triangle and you forget what it is, don't forget to ask and we'll just give you the Swedish word as well.